Muammar Gaddafi, in an address to the African Union, put forward the proposal that all Africans around the world should be guaranteed solace in the land of their origin. Now, these series of debates will seek to identify why little progress has been made on this front, with only one African nation openly encouraging the return of Africa's stolen people. The series of debates will hopefully form part of a future academic work that can be presented as a blueprint to African political bodies to adopt and to formulate into an instituted pathway for the return of the Africans in the diaspora, such as the economic advantages and also the challenges that must be addressed for successful reintegration. So this body of work will hopefully come together with this concise document. Okay, this is what we've all been waiting for, our fantastic panel. I'm just going to read through their bio and introduce them. And as I introduce them, they will appear on screen. So first, I'd like to introduce and this isn't in no particular order, Sister Shanice from the UK. Sister Shanice is the author, radio presenter, and a radio presenter. Now, Sister Shanice points to the core of African problems as have been 2,000 years of miseducation, brainwashing, and the indoctrination of self-hate, and that substantive yet powerful works against the rise of the great African race and its nation and the cause of our continued self-destruction. She's got a stream of videos, and all her videos will leave you questioning the entire education system and wondering if it's actually designed to cripple or to grow us and rise. Okay, that's Sister Shanice. From representing the USA, Ghana, and Ghana is Sister Ya. Sister Ya is the founder, CEO, president of Sankofa Repatriation Assistance Program, Incorporated. She holds a degree in political science and a law degree. She also has served as an assistant and public defender for the Shelby County Court Public Defense Office. She managed her own law practice before she took up a position as Assistant Attorney General in the Department of Justice in the U.S. Virgin Islands. She has served as an Assistant Public Defender for the Shelby County Public Defender's Office also. Introducing from Liberia, Isaac Va Tukpa. Isaac is the founder CEO of Sustainable Development International, with a focus on bringing holistic development through the use of renewable energy, water management, and agriculture. He's a senior project manager and has extensive experience in healthcare, information technology, operations, and finance. Isaac is also involved in an effort to create a virtual internet community for all things Black within platform of the United African Business Network. He believes proper contextual education is critical to the process, and that belief extends to Africa as well. From the USA, Ghana, and Zanzibar, we introduce to the panel Shannon Akusa McGee. Shannon holds dual citizenship between the USA and Ghana. Shannon is founder of Akusa and Associates, a travel repatriation and relocation consultancy based in Ghana. Shannon is involved in several projects on the continent, improving mental health for women and teenage girls, or maternal health, I should say, for women and teenage girls. In Ghana, she's involved in fundraising for scholarships, building schools, identifying investors interested in infrastructure and agriculture. She also is involved in the Gender Equity Program in Zanzibar, a partnership with Ben Bella Secondary School for Muslim girls. She dedicates much of her time in educating diasporans about the importance of citizenship and political inclusion in the African countries. Thank you. Last but not least is Mbeki. Mbeki is an international educationist, poet, author, and international speaker. For her, the role of education has always been one that has embraced and practiced in the widest sense. A qualified teacher and international school inspector, an executive coach and trainer, an author and poet. She has worked in Jamaica, Cameroon, Ghana, and Malaysia. As an international educator, she has seen firsthand how the colonizers' curriculum and programs continue to affect African people. More information about all the panelists can be found on the website by going to the bigafricadebate.com, scrolling down, and you will find more information on all the panelists, all their links and details about them, and their extended bio. So with that, I would like to welcome all the panelists to this debate, and we're going to kick off the debate with the first question that's been sent in. And this question is directed to Sister Shanice. Sister Shanice, language being the vehicle of communication, doesn't the problem start from there?
I would have to agree. Yes, it does. Let me just check that you can hear me okay. Are you hearing me?
Yes, I can hear you, and I presume we all can. You'll be coming full screen on camera in a second. I've just got to do some switching at my end, but please continue.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate on the panel of this very important discussion. Yes, with regards to language, I think language is very, very important. And one of the reasons for that is because language is generational, language is handed down. And what's carried with the language is the culture, is the knowledge of the history. There's a lot of information. It's entwined, that's intricately entwined with the language. There's information about the environment, the way things are done, you see, and I feel that a lot of that is actually lost when you adopt a different language for educating yourself. So, for example, in many African countries that were formerly colonized by the British, the standard is that English is the language that's used for education. Well, English itself is a language that has been fused together and made up of 3 different languages. At the root of it is Latin, then you've got French, and you've got German fused together. So you've got these 3 languages that are fused together to make up the English language. So there's a lot of confusion anyway when you're using English. So I'll give you an example. When we look at education in the English dictionary, for example, we can see that the definition of education there is about the process of facilitating learning or the acquisition of knowledge, skills, beliefs, and habits, okay? It also talks about, in terms of educational methods, the teaching methods, training, storytelling, discussion, directed research, okay? But when you look at the Latin meaning, which is the root word of education, it's got a different meaning. In the Latin, the word education is educare, educere, or educatum. So the word educare means to nourish, to bring out, you know, it's to bring forth, to draw out, you know, the skills, the genius that's already inside of you. Whereas, you know, if I go back to the English definition, and if you look at the meaning of indoctrination, for example, it's very similar to the English definition of education and how it's interpreted. So indoctrination in their dictionary is the process of teaching a person or a group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. And that's largely, to a large extent, what the English school system is about. It's about indoctrination. As the definition says, it's a process of teaching those in the education establishment to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. And so what that actually does, especially as children going into the education system very young, it means that before they've even had the opportunity for their brain to begin to start critiquing things, already what's happening is they're having imposed on them as a group of children in the classroom a set of beliefs, a set of instructions that they are expected to accept uncritically. And that is fundamentally flawed and fundamentally, you know, one of the biggest challenges that we have in the British education system. And so the other major problem in terms of language as well, and when you're learning an education system from somebody else's language. Now, if we're looking at English, for example, that language is no more than about 2,000 years old or so. The Latin they inherited from the Romans, and they were the African Romans. They inherited that from Africa. So they inherited the Latin from the Romans, which is about, you know, you can go back about 2,000, maybe 2,300 years or so with that language. And then the German and the French is even more recent than that. So the history around the English language is quite recent. And obviously it glorifies everything British as well. We'll say more about that. But then when you look at the African languages, for example, they go back hundreds of thousands of years. These are very old languages indeed. And of course, what would have been, you know, carried down the generations with that language would have been all of that wonderful history, all of the knowledge about the environment and everything within the environment, which all will have its special names associated with it. So I do believe that a lot is actually lost, you know, and also lost in the interpretation from African languages to the English language, because I quite often hear friends from the continent say, you know, when they translate from their own language, that there's no word in the English language that enables them to translate what it is they're saying, because the English language is just so limited. And I just want to add, one of the reasons why it is so limited is because if we remember, when the Caucasians came out of the Caucasus Mountains, you know, they came out without a language. They didn't have a language. They were grunting. And you'll see that in some of their old movies as well, where they actually admit that they didn't have a language. So they had to be taught a language, and they weren't the easiest of people to teach either. And if you look at the Latin alphabet as well, which, you know, you can find, it was etched into stone in the way that the Egyptian hieroglyphics was etched into stone. And you can see some of the similarities there as well. You can see that, you know, the first writing that they got was actually from the Latin as well. So it's all fairly new language, and it's very limited as well. So there's a lot that's lost educationally when Africans decide, you know, to negate their own language and replace it with the English. I'll leave it there for a moment for others to come in.
Thank you very much for that in detailed explanation of the English language. Does anyone from the panel like to add to that? No.
On the issue of indoctrination, you know, very well aligned with her, because I just watched another episode of a lady who was speaking on the indoctrination of some of these false precepts and how they happen in the school system, especially with regards to racism. So it's very significant, and how we turn that over and reflect on how we can implement a true kind of African centric education system is very critical. That's why I really appreciate these kind of debates, these kind of webinars and forums where we can really come together and be able to talk about these things and be able to sensitize the people who are listening, and, like you said, put together some kind of academic document eventually that can be given to the powers that be in Africa, especially the African Union, to see how these ideas can be sifted down, you know, to the very local level, that we can be able to build our teaching systems to be inclusive of our own heritage.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, I will stay with you, Isaacs, for the time being. And a question has come in. And what unifying language or languages must we adopt on the continent? Do you want to add to that? Someone asks, what unifying language or languages must we adopt on the continent?
Isaac? I think it's very challenging. Just in little Liberia, with only 4.5 to 4.6 million people, we have 16, you know, local languages. In places like Nigeria and other places, they got numerous other languages. So that challenge would be, do we start at some point and then try to educate all Africans with one unique language? And that in of itself would be a serious challenge, as you know, we have gotten so used to the separation and division of Africa that we are very proprietary in the different kind of unique cultures to each country, and sometimes within countries to each region, sometimes within the regions to the counties, to the specific clan. So when we can relieve ourselves of those clannish and tribal kind of mindset and look at Africa in a pan-African sense and even in a whole, the entire diaspora, then I think we'll be able to do something like that. But it will take a total unlearning of where we are today in our own divisions to be able to get to that point where we can say, we can talk about one unifying African language.
Well, thank you. I guess that answer opens up many more questions. But moving on, this is a question directed to Sister Ya. What is stopping the leaders and the people in African countries from realizing the benefits of learning African history? Sister Ya, would you like to comment on that one?
I'm sorry. You say what is the what?
What is stopping the leaders and people in African countries from realizing the benefits of learning African history?
The leaders themselves were taught through the colonial educational system. So a lot of them just don't know. I've met personally plenty of educated Africans who, and I'm, as someone growing up in the diaspora, I know more about Africa than they do. But I have to say, I was self-taught. I didn't learn it in our schools either. You understand what I'm saying? So I got that information as an adult well after I had graduated law school and got exposed to books and got exposed to scholars that weren't made, I wasn't made aware of in university, in high school. So nobody in undergrad ever mentioned Sheikh Anta Diop to me. Nobody in high school ever mentioned Dr. Ben to me or John Henry Clark in high school, So the leaders don't have the information themselves. So, and what you don't know, you don't know. But I think the onus is those who do know to give them that information, to make that information available to them. So another thing that I noticed, when I'm in Ghana, they don't have access to the books that we have access to. I can jump on Amazon and get Francis Cress Welson's ISIS paper. They can't. You see what I'm saying? So that's a whole nother issue that we have to deal with. We get the information to our people on the continent so that it's accessible to them, so that they know. Because one thing I do know, they want the information. I've had so many brothers and sisters in the continent ask me how, this book, can I get this book? So what are we going to do to make it accessible to them? That is the question.
Okay, well, thank you for that input. I'm going to ask one of the two educators on the panel, and Shannon, if you could just follow up on that question. And further, why has it taken so long to change the colonial curriculum? This is a question directed to Shannon, and if you could pick up on that.
Okay, first of all,
We lost your audio for a second. We heard you, then you went off. So could you just check on your end if you've not switched off your mic? No, we've lost your audio. Yes, it was on for a brief second and it went off. Okay. I will move that question to the
Is this on
educator.
Now. You're back now.
Oh,
okay.
I'm good. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought blue meant off. That's my mistake. To answer your question, if I've heard your question correctly, what is keeping African leaders? What is keeping African leaders from changing the curriculum?
Yes. Well, yeah. The question was sent in. Why has it taken so long to change the curriculum? And I guess this is down to leadership, but you're going to expand on that.
Okay, I think Sister Ya actually summed it up really well. People can't teach you what they don't know, number one. We don't know what we don't know, number two. However, I do think that African leaders recognize that a change needs to happen as we are shifting into a new paradigm, the new Africa. I know this last year, Ghana began to change their curriculum. I think that was a plus because you had various stakeholders in education in a cross-cultural national dialogue about what children should be taught and at what levels they should be taught. And I think this is the beginning of a self-reflective process. We know the system is broken, but how to move forward and fix the system is a different animal. So as Sister Yas said, I agree that, you know, these are the leftovers from a colonial system. It's the neocolonialist mindset that we are dealing with. This is one of the major challenges of development in Africa as we speak. But I do think African leaders in 2020 recognize that there's some changes that need to be made. And unfortunately, we also have to develop what that model should be. Ghana has taken the lead. You have different countries, Tanzania, ensuring that Kiswahili is the official language and that all K through 12 and up should be both Kiswahili and English, empowering our students to do both English and Kiswahili. That's what I'll add. I think it's now happening, and some of us here on this panel should definitely have a seat at that table in terms of how and what that should look like. But I just think there isn't really an African-centered curriculum across the board. You have different brothers and sisters that have localized history based on their experiences in those particular regions. But what does an African-centered education look like? What does the curriculum look like? And this is a work that's in progress that's currently being done.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Shannon. Does anyone of the panel like to expand on that? No? If you could switch on your mic, Mbeki, I can see you're speaking. But,
yeah, I'd like to add something.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening to all the panelists. I think one of the questions that always comes up for me that we really need to ask ourselves is, what is education for? Yeah, what are people being educated for? So if you look at the education system in the UK, it initially came about because it was used as babysitting. It was a way of looking after children who could no longer work in the factories. So it was a practical purpose. It then evolved into educating people for the workplace. Yeah, we're talking about education in a very different way. Yeah, so if we're talking about an African-centered education, we're asking our leaders in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in other places to let go of the connections they have with the old colonial masters and to raise the people they're responsible for in a different way. That's a massive mindset shift that we're asking for right there. Yeah. So when we look at Africa, and I've spent time in Ghana, and having spent time in Malaysia, there are lots of things that I would compare. They're very, very similar. But if you have education that empowers people and has them in a position where they know their full value and they're able to live that value, do you want that as colonial masters? And do the people who have their hands still holding on to the colonial masters through bribes and corruption want that? Often they do not. So what is it we want the education for? Yeah. And to the people who understand that, people like Kwame Nkrumah, who did, and who was influenced by Marcus Garvey, understood that. But a lot of the people around him wanted the bribe money. So getting rid of somebody like that, or other people who are now talking about having an education that reflects their history and their culture in the most positive way, regardless of what language is taught in, yeah, they are often in the minority because the others are not willing to let go of the financial gains that they have from staying linked and partnered with colonial organizations who generally don't have the majority empowerment at their heart.
Staying with you and Becky, possibly to add a bit of humor, you could tell us about the situation that you faced in Jamaica with the Society of People not wanting you because of what you're teaching. If you want to explain that, because I think that's significant with the statement you just made.
Yeah, I mean, I can give two examples. In Jamaica, I taught in a school, and I decided that the US books would not be the tool I would use. As far as I'm concerned, you can teach the principles of writing essays and liberal arts using any tool. So I decided to empower the students around Marcus Garvey and any of the Maroons. And the parents complained and complained and complained, and the principal let me go. That was it. So far as she was concerned, the students did not need to know about their local history in Jamaica. Fast forward to Ghana, I'm now a vice principal at one of the top international schools in Ghana. I'm going around the school, and the teacher, the history teacher, is teaching the students that slavery was a good thing. Now, those of you who are living in Ghana or who have experiences of Ghana will understand this, yeah? So as the vice principal, I was able to say to this teacher, okay, can we have a conversation after this? And when I called him into the office, he said to me that where he came from, his family were involved in the slave trade, and he was always told as a child that it was a good thing. They had benefited from it. So I used the computer and showed him some pictures, and he said, what is that? I said, that's what slavery did to people. That's what it did to our people. And he was silent because he didn't know. Yes, he had never done the research. He had taken the story, the narrative that he had been given, and he had decided to share that. Now, so those children in his classroom in Ghana are coming up, and this is very recent, this is in the last 5 years, those children are being told slavery was a good thing. So when we talk about the curriculum is one thing, the people who deliver it are another, and the attitudes and values that they bring to the curriculum also need to be challenged. So there's a whole load of work that needs to happen at the teacher training colleges, at the government level. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that input. It certainly stimulated some questions. Now, this is an open question to anyone in the panel, and someone is asked the question, isn't the problem of not teaching our children in our mother tongue, whichever that may be with so many languages on the continent, but isn't the problem not teaching in the mother tongue the very root cause of dysfunction or this dysfunction? Does anyone would like to elaborate on that? Shannon, thank you. Your mic again. We seem to have lost your audio.
Okay, so so thank you. I just want to say that we actually have a model. If you take a look at the history of Tanzania and in the 1950s going into the 1960s, the work that former president, our late Julius Nyerere has done, where he brought all of the people in Tanzania that had different mother tongues, and he declared Kiswahili as the official language of the country. We actually have a model where this doesn't have to be chaotic. And it's the one thing when you're on the ground in Tanzania, it matters not what indigenous language the Tanzanians, the national Tanzanians speak. Everybody speaks Kiswahili. And so here's an example where Kiswahili has become a unifying language across the country. And I think it's a really good model for us to examine. Doesn't mean that there's not issues with it, but for the most part, having frequent Tanzania, often I believe the people there feel like this is good. This is a good thing for Tanzania across the board. So we do have a model where we can look at. You have African leaders that are now discussing, should Kiswahili be the language of African diplomacy? Or we used to say back in the day, is Kiswahili, or should it be? Or there's been a big debate, and I thought it was resolved that Kiswahili is the language of Pan-Africanism. So yes, I think everyone might want to be able to offer education in the mother tongue. And I think in the primary years, it should be taught in the mother tongue. I do believe that children should be grounded in their language first. The parents are the first teacher. However, I do think as a common language for us to unify, given our historical unique experience, that we do need to determine what that language will be and then go from there. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Coming back to you, Sister Shanice, question directed to you. Do you think, this is a localized question because it's specific to the UK, I guess, but we can throw it across to the USA as well. Do you think that things will ever change for us as in the African diaspora in the UK? Sister Shanice?
Oh, yes, let me turn on my mic.
You switched it off. It was on, you switched it off.
Okay.
Okay.
You're hearing me now, yeah?
Fine, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, in my opinion, even over the last 50, 60 years here in the UK, there has been a considerable amount of change. We don't often see change from one day to the next, but if you look back over the decades, then we can see the journey and we can see the changes that have actually already been made. And I think that going forward, what we need to do is to be more in control of what that change is going to look like and be in control of our destiny. Quite often, I feel that we kind of move from one day to the next and 1 year to the next, when really we ought to have our 5-year plan, 10-year plan, 50-year plan, and 100-year plan. And that's the same for, changing a curriculum, introducing a new international or global African language, whatever it is that we're deciding to do. I feel that we need to have a plan, and so that we can measure our achievements and our accomplishments. Now, when I look back over the last 50, 60 years of when our parents came here, they were the pioneers who came over from the Caribbean in large numbers. They weren't the first Africans here because, of course, the original Africans on this part of the land, the original people were Africans. The indigenous people of these lands and all the lands in the world were Africans. But that's a huge another story about what happened to them. But in recent times, when we look at the way things were when our parents came here, there were signs on the door, no dogs, no blacks, no Irish. They couldn't get housing anywhere. They weren't able to access loans from the banks. They had extreme difficulty trying to get work, trying to get housing. Life was incredibly difficult for our parents' generation. And on top of all of that, there was the blatant racism that they had to cope with. There was the racial harassment and the racial attacks from lots of different organized white groups. And, as a people in my parents' generation, they had to come together and fight against all of that. And myself being the first generation of those who came to this country, I had first-hand experiences as well when I was growing up through primary school and through secondary school. And I can see the changes, the huge amount of changes that has happened between then and now. Now, we still have a long way to go. We certainly do have a long way to go, and we have a lot of work to do. Because over the last 50, 60 years, from my parents' generation, we've adopted a policy of integration and assimilation into the Eurocentric way of life. And our parents, who were brainwashed and indoctrinated and whitewashed before they came here, because they had a Eurocentric education, believed that they were coming to the motherland. They believed that everything here in the West was best. We were encouraged to abandon our culture, abandon a lot of our way of life and our language and everything, only to realize now that all of that is what we ought to have held dear. And if we could reverse the clocks, we would be adopting a very different approach where it comes to us maintaining our language and our cultural way of doing things, and also to a large extent maintaining our independence as families and as communities. Because where we've integrated into the British society here, and as I said, lost a lot of our own cultural identity, now what we're facing as a people is being treated as an inferior group of British people, of Black British people in this society. Whereas if we had stayed together and poured our resources and our finances and our energies together as a distinct African group, I feel that we would have progressed and advanced much more than we have done over the last 50 years. And this is the kind of movement and the type of change that's happening at the moment. We're now looking, at how we can work more collaboratively, more collectively, going forward, how we can partner with our brothers and sisters on the continent, and how together, we can help to improve our situation here in the West and also for those on the motherland. So going forward, there is definitely a move and a mood for change, which gives greater recognition to who we are as a people, our history, our culture, and the wealth, our accomplishments, pre the colonial invasions, pre the Arab invasion. So there's been a lot that we have already achieved, but I feel that we need to be more strategic and more planned going forward, and also be working more closely with our brothers and sisters on the continent, and very importantly as well, be de-brainwashing, the shackles of our minds. We've got to get rid of the colonial mindset and replace it with an African-centered mindset that puts Africa first, our culture, our pride, and everything else.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Sister Shanice. To summarize, I think what I picked up from that is that integration hasn't quite worked to our advantage, and we need to look at as group politics, group economics, and working together as a group.
I wanted to add to that, if I may.
Okay, Shannon, please do.
So first of all, I just want to say that for the last about 60 years let me speak to the United States, there's been a lot of work around developing African-centered curriculums and how it's connected to our, as we say, our liberty, or as it's connected to nation building. So the first thing I think I want to do, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we have an organization called the Council of Independent Black Institutions. And they actually gave us a definition to work with for what African-centered education should be and what it should do. And so I just wanted to read that for you. The Council of Independent Black Institutions define African-centered education as the means by which African culture, including the knowledge, attitudes, values, and skills needed to maintain and perpetuate it throughout the nation building process, is developed and advanced through practice. So with this definition of African-centered education, there's been some work that our forebears, our ancestors have put in the United States, because out of the Black Power movement and the Pan-African national movement were born Black independent institutions in America. And from Black independent institutions in America, let's say by the early 1990s, we had about 38 schools across some of the major cities in America that actually had thriving institutions. It's unfortunate, I can't say that now, a lot of those schools have moved into the direction of charter schools, many just to be able to financially sustain themselves. And that's because African Americans at that time, Africans of the diaspora living in America, opted for a more, to integrate more into society, and they began to think about economic competition. So I just wanted to say that for the last 60 years, there's been steadfast work on putting together curriculums. There's a resource that I provided right now, a young lady by Beverly Jackson. She published like last year in December. She published and defended what the virtual space for African-centered education should look like. I think I forwarded that resource to you. So I just, want us to, there's a paradigm shift happening. I agree with our sister that this conversation definitely should be transatlantic conversation. in addition to that, HBCUs now, historically Black colleges and universities, are now having a presence on the continent. Specifically, an example I can point to is Morgan State University now has a solid partnership with the African University of Communications College here in Ghana. So we're starting to see some of these partnerships, some of this dialogue taking place. HBCUs have a huge virtual conference taken up involving presidents from historically Black colleges and universities that will be on a panel as part of a dialogue with African presidents of African universities and tertiary institutions. So though it's slow, it is coming. And I am hoping that as we are reaching the mid-COVID awakening, I don't know what to call it, but this is a work that can move, that can be expedited. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. I'd like to bring in on this next question, probably the two educators, that's Shannon
Before we go to the next
and also
on that whole
sorry, just a moment, Isaac. So I'll bring you to you. This is my next question coming up. You want to add on to what Sister Shannon just said? Okay, I'll bring you in a second. Right. I'll give the others a bit of thought about the next question. And this is basically, I'd like everyone's own take on this question. And it's basically saying, okay, if the governments are not moving in the direction that we would want them to, what can the grassroots do? So please come in on this, Isaac, and then answer that question. So if you could come in on this.
Well, it's kind of similar because historically our governments are slow. Even people were asking about whatever African leaders, understand the curriculum in place and stuff like that. So there's two major things have happened that has basically changed the way we live, right? The whole racism thing and the level of awareness that is now being created with what happened with George Floyd, and the COVID-19 situation as well. So there's a lot of awakening, and like the lady just said before, it's slow. And we, the people, the grassroots and the different institutions that are non-governmental need to really start to get together to build some kind of non-governmental kind of sequentially plan about creating these educational opportunities for our people, right? We know there's no real standardization in a lot of places in Africa. The inequity in education is huge. So they have to start thinking about these solutions and what we are teaching, because it's really Africa's time. We have come to this point where our economy is now like nearly $7 to $8 trillion in Africa. We got 1.3 billion people. We have the youngest population in the world, probably at an average age of 18 or 19, something like that. Most of the world's mineral resources come from Africa, the gold, the diamonds, the platinum. So we have a huge stake in the economy of the world. And that's why I tend to preach on Pan-Africanomics, right? Where we try to take hold of our own economy. We try to build supply and value chains right on the continent, where we can try to map capabilities to where we need to get our finished product to. The whole African trade environment need to be restructured in a way that we actually really trade on the continent with each other to the mutual benefit, not to be exploitative of the weaker and smaller countries. But those with huge economies have to be able to expand their economic policies in a way that incorporates these smaller countries. I mean, when you come to the labor force, by 2030, it's estimated that we have 1 billion workers in Africa. That will be bigger than any continent. Our youth will be the ones that will fuel us. We have to create now education in a way that is African-centric in terms of the economic capability of the continent, being able to really provide for the future of the continent and build it. We are going to be the fastest urbanizing continent in the world, because we know today we only probably have about 40% urbanization in Africa. So we have a long way to go to get to that 85, 90% like most other places. So we have a road to go. We have a positive road ahead of us. And the African leaders, the African Union really need to take a strong look at the economics and the education, because they are really tied in. If we are still uneducated about the benefits of Africa and what our heritage is and what we can do, will lose out continuously in this global marketplace, as we see how the Chinese are really advancing into Africa, and even the Americans are reawakening and rethinking their whole approach and policy towards Africa. So it's just essential that we consider the economics with the education and let them walk hand in hand as we try to develop, our continent. And also the diaspora is extremely important.
Okay, Sister
Go ahead. Go. I'll let you finish. I just wanted to know. I wanted to
okay. So critical. We have seen places like Ethiopia and Rwanda and a couple of other African countries where the inclusion of the diaspora has made a dramatic impact on how the economies are booming and how they are, comparing with other places in the world. So I push that a lot with Liberia in terms of how can we get, because we have experts nearly in every profession who are at the top of their profession. If the folks on the ground can only incorporate these people and not feel threatened or not feel insecure, where the diaspora, whether African American or just Africans, from the continent, to incorporate them in how they govern, how they operate, it can make a significant difference for us as we move forward, trying to, build a stronger Africa.
Okay, Sister Yaa, please come in on this.
That's coming after.
Yeah. And then followed by Becky.
The grassroots. Okay. To answer the question that was asked, what can the grassroots do? Because I'm of the mindset that we don't have to wait on government for everything, right? So what we need to do as a people, I would like to see enlightenment centers that the people can pick a location and they can have, we can ship in books, right? We can do book drives from the diaspora to send books in, and we can do lectures there. We can have guest speakers to come in and talk on differences in terms of our history as African people. We can have places where we can talk about alternative energy, how to, get solar set up in communities and community water and things like that. We don't have to wait for government to do everything, right? So, I'm not ready to wait for government to do anything because, like she said, these people are very slow and we need things right now. So I'm actually right now in the middle of trying to get a location in Ghana. What we want to call is the Sankofa Ubuntu Enlightenment Center, where we have a section set up where young people can come in after school and read, and we can bring in lecturers, on the weekends to have these discussions. And like our sister Makiba said, they don't know. My husband told me that, he's heard plenty of Ghanaians, my husband Ghanaian, he's heard plenty of Ghanaians say that if the slavery was to start back up, they would volunteer to go because they literally don't know what happened to us. They think that we got the better end of the stick we ended up in the United States. So we have to create these centers where we can come together and share information with each other. And what Sister Shanice said early on, I wanted to go back, is true. A lot of things get lost in translation. My husband is talking, and I hear him say, he's talking in Tree or Fanti, and I ask him, well, what does that mean in English? And he'll sit there for a minute, and he'll sit there, and then he'll say, "There's no word for it, right?" In English, right? And so I'm sitting there like, so I remember the first time he told me that when I was in Ghana. So I felt sad for myself because I felt like, so you are capable of having a thought that I can't have because of the limit, because I'm in a whole different language. You know what I'm saying? So the fact that the Ghanaians have a thought that there's no way to express that thought in English, so I don't know what that is. You know what I'm saying? So
that's very powerful.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely. I say to that person that asked the question, let's not wait on government to do everything for us. Let's do it ourselves. We know what needs to be done for our people. So let's get together and let's do it.
Yeah, thank you. You've opened up a very interesting point there in having these centers where books can be sent to, so that it can be certainly, get to the hands of those who really need that education. Mbeke, if you could come in on this, please, because I know you want to comment on this. Is your mic on?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, fine.
Okay, just a couple of very quick points. I think the Sister Ya's point about the Enlightenment centers is fantastic, and they definitely need to happen. In terms of government, the people who genuinely make things happen are not linked to government. They're not asking them for money. They are self-reliant, and that's for a reason. The government has one agenda. If you're talking about moving in the direction that's possibly against that agenda, you have to be self-reliant. In the UK, we have people who are doing things. We have ADPAC. We have 100 Black Men of London. We have the organization of supplementary and Saturday schools. There are organizations here who are doing things. Unfortunately, it's splintered. And I think that's happening a lot. There are people in Ghana who are doing things, but they're doing it by themselves. And actually what needs to happen for me as I look around and meet people from different parts of the world, both in the UK and on the continent in different parts. For one, I've spoken to people about different approaches to education. I've spoken to people in Ghana. We need to start thinking about what I call circles of professional practice, because even in this country, if we want to challenge the curriculum, we have enough professionals in education in this country who could write a curriculum. We have enough people here who could write an African-centered curriculum that we can use. We have enough professionals who understand how curriculums are written. We have that around the world. What we don't have are those ongoing circles of professional practice where those people come together and have a clear plan about what they want to do. When I saw the title of this event, I thought, okay, I'm in my 50s. 30 years ago, I was carrying my daughter on my back to events that were discussing the same thing. Yeah. So we could carry on having this discussion for the next 10, 20, another 30 years. Or we can say, okay, we know what the solutions are, because nobody here doesn't know. But what we need to do is have clear plans and stick to those plans and make them happen. We talk too much. Yes. And we've been talking too much for years. And the talking is important sometimes because the new generation comes and they need to hear some of the arguments, but the doing is even more important.
Yes, thank you very much for that input, Mbeke. I agree with you 100%. Just to add in my 2 cents, I went to a meeting recently of young Black people, probably my grandchildren's age, and they were talking about the issues that they were encountering. Yes. And I thought, my God, this is the same issues I was encountering like 30 plus years ago. Exactly. So a lot has changed, but nothing has changed. Exactly. And I certainly, I can relate to everything which you've just said. Thank you. Shannon, you'd like to come in on that?
Yeah, so I've been a part of the technical side. This is where theory has to meet practice. There's our theorists, our babas that have given us the content, and then there remains the technical expertise, the kind of, as I heard Brother Isaac was saying, to standardize what African-centered education should look like, and even to have discussions about standardizing African-centered education. That's a whole nother 20 years. I was at a professional development about 10 years ago, maybe a little over 10 years ago. This professional development was facilitated by our ancestor, Baba Ajay, out of Nations House African Center School, which is based in Washington, D.C. It's one of our oldest African Center schools. And he asked us one question. We were a group of young people and he left us in the room. He asked us one question. He said, define the migration out of Africa. Define the migration out of Africa. It's about 10 years later and I still don't know how to answer that question. And we were in a room and I was with other African-centered teachers. These are people with PhDs grounded in African-centered pedagogy. And we struggle with answering that question. So the question becomes, are we speaking Twi? Are we speaking Kiswahili? Are we speaking Kikuyu? Like what language are we going to use? to begin with, because we have acknowledged that the indigenous language is very important. Even in Ghana, we have over 200 indigenous languages here. So we first decide on what language we're going to use. Then there's a process of teaching ourselves that language based on what we're saying here in order to begin the work to dig deep into the curriculum. Then it's how should it be taught? Well, most of what's out there is Eurocentric values that guides the process of organizing a curriculum. Because when you look back at the true definition of education in Africa, it was never confined to a school building. It was never confined to a school calendar. Education was about your rites of passage. It was about learning what you needed to become a valued member of that community. Not only a valued member, but you had to participate in the community, and you were responsible for the community's longevity of the culture and of the language. And you learn how to defend it. So I just think that the standardization of African-centered education, I think it's coming. I don't want to be like all pessimistic. I think it's coming. I just think there's a lot of discussions that still need to happen. The second thing I would say is this is the work of, excuse me to say, that Black Lives Matter. This is really what they should have in front of them, is a plan to overhaul the education system. I think as we see civil unrest, it took a disease to make the world be still for us to really get back to the basics, something life-threatening, right? So then what is it gonna take to move our agenda forward? The last thing I wanted to say is that people in Africa on the ground, to be honest, we worried about how we're gonna eat tomorrow. So if you're worried about your day-to-day, and if you're worried about how are you going to thrive in this informal sector, right? I think we are mistaken if we think it's just going to be easy. This is a person, I've had 2 institutions from K through 12 in Ghana over 15 years. And in doing so, there's a lot to be learned. I created the curriculum. I actually have students now that are entering college that started with me from nursery school. So having seen the entire process work out, and my goal was a school created by diasporans to help demystify the myths, help bridge the cultural gaps, help teach them about the history, as I was charged to do. W.E.B. Du Bois's stepson, David Du Bois, was my advisor in university. And I remember him telling me that if I'm going to open a school in Ghana, it has to be to teach Africans about racism and about, I don't know, let me just say the wicked ways of Europeans. Let me just put it out there. So with that, I'm just saying that it's, in theory, it's beautiful. But when you get to the technical expertise and the mechanics of what's needed to design curriculum, that is where the work should be done. And I think this should be the charge of the next generation. Each generation that comes adds to, and eventually we get to having a curriculum that's about liberation. I'm not saying we don't do nothing right now. I'm just saying that it's bigger, it's a lot bigger, and every generation comes and they contribute a level of organization. Because we're really trying to undo the Maafa, which is difficult to do. Maafa, Kiswahili word meaning the great disaster, as it explains our passage from Africa to the diaspora and the current day-to-day ills that we face, and ultimately, right in front of us now, our return back to Africa. So I'm sorry for keeping so long. That's what I wanted to add.
No, that's fine. I appreciate that comment. I think that certainly, I think speaking to myself and I think most of the panel, what you identified there is this has to be a work in progress. It's certainly not going to be defined or turned around in one generation. And as been said, this has been spoken about now for 2 generations. And I certainly believe, from my point of view in traveling the continent, that we are at the pivotal moment when this has been talked about more. And I think that the next generation coming up, if we can get some of these materials in their hands so they can understand how they've been brainwashed and start to, because it all starts with de-brainwashing, as Sister Shanice pointed out. So with that said, does anyone else want to come in on that before I move to the next question, which will be directed to Isaac? No? Okay, Isaac. Someone here has put a question to you, which is the AU, African Union, and its members need to collectively create a situation where all our children in the diasporas, that's doctors, nurses, teachers, lecturers, engineers, builders, scientists, all of us go home to build a new Africa. Like what Fuse, I'm not sure what this is probably above my pay grade. What Fuse OGD says, Tina, this is a new Africa. Why can't we make this happen? I think you understand the part of that question. I personally didn't understand the last part, but you've suggested that
the first part,
you could
the
answer.
last part, I'm not sure.
Okay, we're both saying.
Fuse is a Ghanaian musician, and he has a campaign called "This Is the New Africa." So
okay, thanks
so
for
she's quoting
educating us there. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah, I think we need to be like very clear on what that new Africa is or what that vision is. The African Union has done some things, and the most recent African Union representative in the United States, I think her name is Arikana Shimburi. She was making drastic moves to integrate the diaspora with what's happening on the continent. And she's still actively trying to do some of that, even though she's not in a position. I believe she has established, I think, an African Development Institute. I don't know the exact name, but she's taking strides in that direction. I think the leaders on the continent need to really do that. And for example, on my part, I'm starting a new movement called the Liberia Integration and Transformation Movement, right? We need to integrate our people. There are so many levels of integration with people in the diaspora and people in Africa. Here we're talking about education. There's the opportunity for investment. There's the opportunity for actual participation in a business in terms of the back part, helping with the infrastructure, helping with the strategic planning, helping with the visioning, and trying to implement some of those things practically for these different organizations. So there's so much our brothers and sisters can contribute towards the continent, but we need a real robust and embracing program. And one of the ways I'm doing that is, we mentioned the United African Business Network is kind of a sort of like a LinkedIn product that people can go to, where we want all things Africa to be present there, right? Some people were asking about how can we get all these African center organizations so that people can be aware of them, they can be one place. So the United African Business Network is a location that if all the different African organizations can register, it can be a central place where you can find African nonprofits, African businesses in any, African governments having presence in that space. So that is what we are seeking, and we think we need something like that, like for and our people on the continent to really start to collaborate and to cooperate in a centralized environment where all these disaggregated pieces of islands of expertise, capabilities that we have around can come together in one place. That it can be so much easier for people to search, for people to make some comparisons, and for people to understand where we are going as a people.
Thank you very much for that input, Isaac. I'm going to invite questions from people in the audience to chat right now. If you've got the questions, please put it in the chat. Please put a Q, and then your question, so I can quickly identify questions coming in from the chat. So questions are now open for live input from the chat. If you've got questions, Q, capital Q, and then your question, and I'll be able to pick that up to the chat and put it to the panel. Now, to move on, I am just checking the panel to see if there are any questions in there already. And a lot of people are agreeing and they're talking amongst themselves, so that's pretty lively. This is a question open to the panel. Why do you think African countries are not using an African-centered curriculum? And do you think another nation is deliberately ensuring this does not happen. So someone is thinking that there's an outside hand, which we know there's plenty outside hands in African business. But do you think that this is deliberately, there is forces that be deliberately ensuring that this does not happen? That's it, adopting an African-centered curriculum. No, Sister Chinese?
Yes, I'll comment on that. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I organized trips to Africa, and I've already done a number of trips to Zimbabwe. And one of the stories that we were being told about education in Zimbabwe is that under the colonial, when the country was colonized and the Europeans were ruling the country, there were very few schools, and I think there might have only been one university or a couple of universities that Africans were allowed to go to. So education wasn't being encouraged at all. Education was primarily for the children of the Europeans. They were the ones that were going to go on to run the businesses and control the corporations, etc. And the Africans were considered just to be the servants, the workers. You know, they were the ones that were being abused under the apartheid system, and so there were very few colleges, schools, etc. But then after the liberation struggles, when Robert Mugabe took over, his priority was education. So from the 1980s, his priority was education, education, education. But what they did, because they didn't have their own curriculum, was they invited teachers to come from all around the world to come to Zimbabwe to teach. And he had a policy of building new schools, new colleges, universities, and to the point where today they are considered to be the most highest, the African country with the highest number of graduates, the most highly educated African country. However, even though they've got that status, the unemployment level in that country, especially amongst the youth, is so high. And a lot of Zimbabweans, after they qualified at university, were looking elsewhere for work. They were looking outside of Zimbabwe for work, because the bottom line was they were being educated or indoctrinated with an education that was preparing them for jobs that didn't exist in Zimbabwe. They were being prepared for jobs that existed in Europe. So the education that they were getting in Zimbabwe wasn't enlightening them about the 63 different precious minerals, for example, that they've got under their feet. It wasn't educating them to get an understanding as to how to mine those precious stones, how to process it, how to refine it, how to turn it into useful goods, how to package it and how to sell it. You know, it wasn't educating them how they could become the great farmers of tomorrow to take over. You know, there's a wealth of minerals and a wealth of resources in Zimbabwe, but they were being taught an education that was preparing them, say, for Wall Street or the City of London, or for great institutions and organizations that have been developed over hundreds of years that are now in the West. And so there's a major disconnect between the local needs and what the education system was educating them for. So what clearly should have happened after the liberation struggles is time should have been taken, as has been already discussed and suggested here in the panel, to write a curriculum that was relevant and fit for purpose. But that didn't happen, and it really does need to happen, because as a result of the education, Robert Mugabe, I mean, he's introduced hundreds, possibly thousands of schools across the country. But unfortunately, they were being taught a Eurocentric education. So they were glorifying everything European and, you know, seeing everything African as inferior. So all those that qualified, not all those, but some of the great brains and the great thinkers are now running banks and universities and science labs and are in big jobs outside of Zimbabwe. And that's a tragedy for a lot of Africa, actually, the big brain drain. So what continues to happen with this Eurocentric education is that Europe benefits from, you know, Africans' intelligentsia. All of that intelligence, all of those brains and all of that creativity ought to be getting channeled back into Africa, but instead it's not. It's, you know, Europe continues to get the benefit of it. And the education is such that, you know, people will put their lives at risk to go the back way on dinghy boats to try and get to Europe, to get the jobs that are not in their own country, because they haven't been educated and taught to see the opportunities, the vast amounts of opportunities that exist, you know, within their own villages, their own towns and their own cities where they are. So there's a great mismatch, and there's a lot that needs to be done there. So let me stop there to allow others to come in, because I can see a few signals.
Okay, and Becky, I can see that you want to come in on that. So, and I also have a question for you following up on your comment that you're about to make.
Okay, just very quickly, Sister Shanice, that experience that you refer to in Zimbabwe is very much an experience that happens throughout many African countries. Many of the schools are modeled on the elite. So you have the Etons in Zimbabwe, you have the Etons in Ghana, you have those kind of schools that they're modeled on. And so the education system is designed for them to have other people that they strive to be, and other places that they strive to be in. Most people are not taught how to be entrepreneurs successfully, whereas actually being an entrepreneur is a great career path for lots of people in Africa. There are organizations like the African Leadership Academy, who have a branch in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Mauritius. And their model is that they appeal to African students where the bulk of their scholarship is paid for, but in return, they have to commit to staying in Africa for 10 years to building up Africa. So they're encouraged to be entrepreneurs, they're encouraged to be innovators, but they have to make a commitment to Africa so that that brain drain that we've seen over the past few years doesn't continue. So I think there are issues in modeling education on places that do not strive to benefit Africa. And then there are alternatives that are coming up slowly. Plus there are grassroots organizations who are doing things on a smaller scale. Yeah, so I wanted to add.
Okay, thank you. We have got a few questions from the panel. Does someone wants to come in there? I think I saw, no? Okay, yeah. Shannon, I'll let you come in on this, and then Isaacs. We're coming towards the end, so we got a few more minutes, and then we'll go over to the audience questions. Okay, so Shannon, if you could come in first, and then Isaacs, you can follow on.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to add that this is what is so dynamic about this Beyond the Returning Forward, and even Sister Ya's Sankofa Repatriation Assistance Program. In light of the brain drain, you have millions of diasporans that are also trying to come home. Right now, repatriation is pretty much a middle class movement. You're getting the creme de la creme, the best of the best come in. Last year, we brought the money with us. It was all of the celebrities, all of the money power. So I think there is something dynamic happening, given the fact that people are returning. Just as many people that are living and have accepted the Eurocentric way, there are those of us that there's an awakening taking place. And it's dynamic in the fact that we are coming home. And the sad part about it is, even when we get there, there's this technical piece again, an infrastructure that is not, that is too fragile to really kind of receive us as it stands today. But the work is being done. We are coming home. We do recognize what the needs of Mama Africa are. And we are hoping that countries, African leaders embrace us, that, you know, we do have the expertise, and we're ready to come home, and we're ready to give our expertise and lend it to the nation building of Africa. And we recognize the significance and the importance of the work that our ancestors have started, that we need to continue with that. So just as people are leaving, we're coming. We're banging on the door saying we want in, we want to come home. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Shannon. Isaac, if you'd like to come in now, please.
Yeah. Quickly, I want to talk about, just touch on, like, three quick things, right? The first thing is, you mentioned earlier about, one country in Africa that really opening the doors for, African Americans or just other Africans out there. But I just want to say that in Liberia, our constitution, specifically Article 27B, says that in order to preserve, foster, and maintain the positive Liberian culture, values, and character, only persons who are Negroes or of Negro descent shall qualify by birth or by naturalization to be citizens of Liberia. So basically, inherent in our constitution is an invitation to anybody of Negro descent to come and be a citizen and to join us. So that's an open invitation out there to all those who are, wanting to come to Africa. We do have a strong connection in terms of our relationship with the United States and the history there as well. So it's very open for people to join us in Liberia and be a part of this, which is wonderful. The second thing I want to say, and she mentioned, is that there are quite a few people who are doing this Back to Africa engagement in terms of, exposing people in the diaspora to what's happening in Africa, trying to bridge that cultural gap. That is very laudable, and we hope that it can continue. We hope that effort can expand. Because it will help the economy of these African countries. It has been helping them, but it will just integrate the culture more. People get a better understanding of each other and be able to work together. But as on the economic side, that the initial question I wanted to address is that what are we teaching to our people, right? So things like technical and vocational stuff should not be an afterthought for people who may already have dropped out of school or not interested in school and being in that population. It should be an active part of our agenda, because we need to do some labor studies to understand where our economies are going. Where would the jobs be for people who are 10, 12, 15 years old in the next, and 10 to 15 years. So it's very critical that these things be customized so our children can learn and be prepared to be able to protect Africa's interests and be competitive with the rest of the world. Because the economy of Africa is growing so fast, and there will be so many things, so many ways that jobs can be created for people. We just have to be creative. We have to be innovative. We got to feel that this is our time. We own this. Our continent is really like the economic, the mineral, and the food bread basket for the world. So if we can have that mindset, that kind of empowered mindset, and continue to share that with the younger people and with other Africans, with even our own peers, that's where we are right now. And if we take advantage of it, Africa will be restored to its, kingdomness, and people will really respect the advances that we can make when we work together.
Thank you very much for that. Certainly, my input there, out of all the debates we've had, and we've had several now, this to me is probably the most significant, because I think it points to one of the core things which needs to be done first is education on both sides of the world, in the US, UK, and Europe and the African continent. Now, does anyone want to come in on that? I do have some questions from the panel. Sister,
okay, very briefly.
All right. Okay, please continue. Just jump in when you feel like, and then we can.
If I can just add a little something to the entrepreneurial spirit that I also did come across in Zimbabwe. It's very, fair to add this side as well, because I went to a place called Mbare, and it's like an industrial city. And it had so much of a buzz, of a hustle and a bustle, and lots of young people, very creative, very skilled, and very talented young people doing creating amazing pieces with almost scraps. It could be old vehicle tires, for example. They were turning it into wonderful slippers and wonderful shoes. Old engines, they were remodeling those engines, and then someone else in the team would spraying them over, and they would look brand new, but they were remodeled ones. They were cutting wood, and there was a carpentry section going on, and it was streets and streets and streets of just enterprise and entrepreneurialism. But it was a very dusty, very dirt track kind of area, but there's so much potential there. It was just a wealth of talent. Everything was like, recycled and was brought back into use. And you could just see from that, if our people on the continent had the tools, they could do so much. They were doing so much already with the little that they had. Also, just to comment on the financial sector in Zimbabwe as well. As you know, the West have imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe because they dared to take back their land. So as a result of the sanctions that have been imposed on them, they've frozen a lot of their assets. They've frozen a lot of the money that they've got in the banks. They make it extremely difficult for money to circulate. They were refusing to recognize their money. So everything that Zimbabwe did to get around the problem. So, for example, when it was freezing the money, they started printing their own money. So then, the international banks decided they weren't going to recognize their money. So they were having to buy everything in dollars. And so they were having to sell, to get money in dollars. But they also very ingeniously went to mobile money. And so nearly everybody did transactions from the phone. So when you go over there, you get like money put on your mobile phone. You can go into supermarkets, petrol station, everywhere, anywhere, and just shop with mobile money. So there's so much creativity that's already existing there. So they are light years ahead. We haven't even got mobile phone money here in the UK as yet, for example. So, don't only want to talk about the challenges, also want to just recognize, the great works that's going on out there. And when you consider that country's been under sanctions, I think probably about 20 years now, it is doing incredibly well. It's a beautiful country. It has some of the wonders of the world. It's got a majestic animal kingdom. You can go and see the giraffes and the elephants. It's absolutely stunning. And despite the media, there are still, nevertheless, a lot of Europeans concentrated in different parts of the country, and they are continuing to take advantage of certain economic sectors. So they've cornered the tourism industry, for example. So a lot of money that comes into the country via tourism goes into their pockets. A lot of them own some of the big supermarkets as well, and they're not recirculating the money back into the bank, but everybody spends about 80% of their salary on food. So that's going into the European supermarkets, and then it's going straight back out, probably into their outside bank accounts, and so, and they've also trying to hold on to the agricultural market as well, which is for them to feed their people, in Europe, and not necessarily in the country. But people are very independent, they're very resilient, and under the circumstances, they are doing so well. And you could see that if it weren't for the sanctions, that country would be doing, 10 times better than it already is. So, we're a resilient people, and we're already doing great stuff. I think we just need to be more strategic. We need to have plans in place, and we need to be able to share models of good practice as well, probably through these centers of excellence that we were talking about that's needed in each of the countries, for learning and for sharing information. So I think the future's bright for the relationship that we're establishing with Africa. We're making Africa trendy. We're making Africa the place to go and visit. When I was younger growing up, the images and the narrative about Africa was so geography, but we're changing all of that. And I think it's up to each and every one of us to just keep changing the narrative and putting out, how great and how beautiful and how wonderful Africa really is, because she certainly is paradise.
Certainly. Thank you very much for that, Sister Shanice. Does anyone want to come in on that? We're now coming to...
Can I just say that?
I just wanted...
okay, Mbeke, after Shannon, and then we'll take you, and then we'll come to some questions in the chat, and then we'll come to a final roundup. So please, Shannon, continue.
Okay, my apologies. I've got to leave now. My apologies, because I've got another meeting that starts now. But I want to thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure to have you on the debate, Sister Shanice.
Thank you all.
If you could just mention for the audience where they can find you, although the information is on the sign up page.
Yes, if they go to your website, all my links are there. Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you so much, and do check out my YouTube channel, The Sister Shanice Show. One love, family.
Okay, Sister Shanice, thank you very much for participating.
Bye, Shanice.
Bye, y'all.
Um,
Take care.
Okay, Shannon.
I just wanted to make a quick comment with regard to what Sister Shanice was saying, but also with Brother Isaac, that when you speak about African-centered education, it's not exclusive of vocational and technical. At the very essence of African-centered education is practical skills, vocational and technical, that we need to nation build. So I always want us to talk about African-centered education and not necessarily then go into a separate dialogue about vocation, about the financial sector, because African-centered education, that's what it is. It's about how do we advance our people in our nation. The second thing that I wanted to say is you mentioned briefly about the Constitution of Liberia. And, you know, that's always the elephant in the room, the repatriation of African Americans to Liberia. The only thing I'll say is that let's hope this time that those returning, they are grounded in African-centered education, because the tragedy would be for us to come and then to recreate Eurocentric values and a Eurocentric structure. And I think that's part of the reason why African leaders may be a little hesitant. I don't think it's an excuse, by the way, because if anything, we know what to do differently. And the last thing I wanted to say is I belong to an organization, the American Institute of Resource and Human Development. And one of the things we do is we take teachers, public school teachers in America, we take them to Africa every year. For the last 10 years going back, that is actually how I came to Ghana for the first time. I came with a group of, I was teaching 6th grade in Atlanta Public Schools. And I came because we were learning and collecting primary resources so that we could create curriculum to demystify Africa and also to reverse the negative stereotypes of Africa in American public classrooms. This is actually funded by the U.S. State Department, and this is a part of the U.S. Fulbright Hays program. So I'm just saying that this is something you can do now, in addition to the Enlightenment Centers. If you're a teacher and you want to learn and gain more professional development on Africa and you don't know where to start, you can start at the American Institute of Resource and Human Development. We create curriculums that we localize for American schools. So it's very interesting because we normally end up in Ghana. We've been in Botswana. We've been also in Tanzania. We've been in Brazil, and we've been in Colombia. So those are just a few spaces where Africans find themselves that we're still trying to integrate those curriculums from the many different nations inside of the African-American diaspora. When I say that, I mean Africans that find themselves living in America, into their public school systems. So those are just the two things that I wanted to say. And education in Africa has always been protected and promoted by the bourgeoisie. We know what it is. It wasn't, this European infrastructure wasn't designed for all of us to access it. Right. So as we think African-centered education and just part of the nation building, it has to be inclusive of all of our people.
Yeah,
that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, we're coming to the final rounds of questions. I know you want to say something in Becky, so I'm going to come to you with a question and then you can comment on what you want to do at the moment. Just a moment. Someone wants to know, you mentioned that you were a vice principal of an international school in Ghana. Do you need any teachers presently? So you can answer that question to that person and then you can come in with your thing.
Okay, so means I'm no longer there. I left the school in 2015, and Ghana International is a large school. So they have a large website. So do check the website out. Then you'll find out whether they need any teachers. At this moment, I don't know. So that would be my response to that person. And they are not going to find an African-centered curriculum there. So just to let them know that. Yes, it's a UK curriculum. Yeah. And the other comments that I wanted to make were, we've talked a lot about vocational education, which is so important. And vocational education is seen like the pits in Africa. So if you go to a vocational college, you are almost labeled as dunce and all those other derogatory terms. So there's a whole, again, you know, the need and the value for vocational education is so high, but the change of mindset is even higher, because parents will not encourage their children to go to vocational educations or to go through any kind of vocational training because they don't see that it has value. Yeah. And so whether that vocational education is Afrocentric or Eurocentric, people don't recognize it. Yeah, that's been my experience. So we really need to do the work around understanding the value that vocational training brings to the upliftment of the country overall. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing that we need to think about when we're thinking about how we change perception of education. I think that the other point I wanted to make, and I'm sorry that Sister Shanice had to leave, but sometimes I think it's kind of important that we don't paint Africa as perfect. It's amazing. There are lots of great things, but it's not perfect. And Shannon talked about, you know, the movement back being mainly middle classes. And that's quite significant, because those middle classes can afford air conditioning, they can afford a generator, they can often afford a driver over those bumpy roads, they can afford a helper, they can afford the stuff that actually cushions them from what the majority of people are having to experience. So those rose-tinted glasses that we bring when we've been for a week or two, that normally leaves you after you've been there for a few months, when you're sitting in a house, say, with no water or no electricity, or your generator is not working, or the plumber hasn't turned up for 2 days or 2 weeks. So, you know, let's not paint it as perfect. There are so many opportunities there. There's so much that needs to happen, and there's so much that we have as diasporans to bring to that new narrative. But let's just remind people, it's not perfect. And you may not have internet for a week or 2 or 3, or you may have internet, but you can't get a connection. So, you know, people have to also be prepared for that. Okay, that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to come to the final. We're going to take just one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask you all to just say what you do and how people can contact you, and just give a little bit about yourself. Leah, how do we reimagine assessments and the purpose of assessments on the continent? Now, I'm not an educator, so she may be talking about education. I'm not sure. Does that make sense to anyone?
Yeah.
Okay, so yes. Okay, Shannon, if you could answer that.
Well, first of all, I think every assessment we should move back to having practical assessments. Again, African-centered education is about nation building. And based on the definition that the Council of Independent Black Institutions defined in the early 70s, it's about developing nation building and the practice of it. So the only assessment should be is, are we producing entrepreneurs? Are we producing young people that are competent in the financial sector? Are we producing young people, if it's whatever our problems are the young people behaving in a solution-oriented, cultured, forward manner? And the assessment should be designed around there. If, for an example, if we lack good urban planning and infrastructure, the test in the assessment of your young people should be the development of roads and urban planning themselves. That's it. This entire way that we assess students now with the standardized testing, if those questions and responses at the end of that assessment are not connected to that country developing, to that student developing, to that family developing, to his community developing, it doesn't need to be assessed. That's just my opinion, and I'm open.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you want to add anything to that, Mbeki, or is that fine?
No. I would say I agree, because assessment has to be for purpose. And again, you know, back to my question, what is the education for? So if you know what you're educating for, then you know what you're assessing for. Too often assessment is abstract, and it's about ticking boxes and getting certificates, whereas actually all the things that Shannon talks about and alludes to are not being checked. So let's make it practical and realistic.
Okay, thank you. There's a few more questions. I'm just going to read them through very quickly. How do we prevent people in the diaspora from coming back and not being the new oppressors? Well, I think that's been answered in a way through our comment, and everybody knows about the situation back in the day with Liberia. Well, I think most people do. I don't want to miss anyone out there. I did put a question in. Are there any African-owned colleges, universities in Africa to teach the history of Africa and what happened to the diaspora? I don't know of any. Does anyone in the audience know of any such institution with solely focuses on African history?
Not solely, but there is the university in Ghana. Oh gosh, who's in Ghana at the moment? That escapes me. They're in
Dr. Abadele Cambone does a lot of work.
Do you know the university in Barakusa?
Yeah, he teaches languages. Cambone, he teaches languages though, right?
Yeah, he teaches languages, but there's some other topics that he touches upon in terms of Africa. So basically, the Institute of African Studies is based at the University of Ghana at Legon. That is one center, one center, and then you have universities that have emerging courses. I am an executive administrator at one of the universities now in Ghana, and we are the only institution that offers a course called Doing Business in Africa. And we understand the importance that when you're doing business in Africa, you have to understand the local conditions on the ground. In order to do business, you also have to understand the culture of the people to do business. So we offered that course, and I'm not at Ashesi.
No.
But so I'm at Academic City University, and so our programs. I didn't want this to be a commercial, but our programs we just approved a new engineering program, industrial systems and engineering. So we're a STEM school. So for an example, my mechanical engineering students, computer science, and electrical and electronics engineering student created 6 prototype ventilators that were recently approved by Ghana Standards Authority. So when we talk about assessments and we're talking about practical knowledge, we're talking about, we were faced with COVID. We only have 67 generators at our public hospitals. And if we don't know how this thing is going to play out, but we needed to be able to build ventilators using local materials to keep our people alive. So I think there are some universities that's on a new trajectory with developing the future African leaders. One of the things we say is, are you future ready? And we have it in mind that, this is about producing African leaders to resolve some of the problems that Africa is currently faced. So I hope I answered the question.
Well, I'd like to bring the debate to a roundup. I think it's been very encouraging. I've learned a lot. Personally, I like the idea put forward of having a center where we can send books to. I got kind of lost in the conversation myself, but whoever suggested that, please get back to me. I'd like to take a part in that. Also, I'd like to keep the next debate is that we will have on this channel is basically, is tribalism hindering the advancement of the continent? And I suppose that can filter into something that Isaac mentioned in terms of so many different languages to be able to unify so that we can move together in a cohesive force. So I guess that could be described as tribalism, or and I did pick up on that in my traveling around the continent, that there is a degree of I am here, I'm there, and we're going to look at that in the next debate, which I will certainly invite anyone that's on the panel right now that wants to take part in that to certainly send me an email. Now, I'd like to thank certainly everyone that's in the audience at this moment watching. I hope you found it, and we'll be asking you for your feedback on the event and each of the panelists. And so please look out for that email and give us your feedback on that. And if anyone is in the audience who believe they have something to say and would like to be on a future panel, please send me an email and I will send you a link to where you can find that information. Actually, I may have it on a slide, I'm not sure. Okay, I'd like to give I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists here, and I'd like to give everyone a chance to now just say where they can be found and promote whatever they're doing in 2 minutes, please. So we'll start off with Sister Ya. We know you've got the Sankofa Repatriation Assistance Incorporation. If there's anything you want to add to that, please, Sister Ya, come in, and then we will move around 2 minutes, and then we will conclude. Your mic, Sister Ya. Not picking you up on audio.
Okay. Sorry about that. I didn't turn the mic on. Thank you very much for having me and to take part in this very important dialogue on what's needed for our people. And you're right, education is the first step. Proper education is the first step. We can be found at sankofarepat.com, Sankofa, REPAT.com. Also on YouTube, Sankofa Repatriation Assistance Program. On Facebook, Sankofa Repatriation Assistance Program. And also that we're on Twitter and Instagram with the same name. And if anybody wants to contact me directly, if they subscribe at the website, sankofarepat.com, I will get the email and I can respond back to them.
Thank you very much. Shannon, if you'd like to.
Thank you. So the first thing I want to do is give a resource that if individuals would like to research more in terms of what the problems are in Africa and then what are the solutions, there's a book that I'm suggesting called The Challenge of African Development, From Neoclassical Liberation to Structural Adjustment Programs. And this is by my mentor, Fredolin Ananobi, Nigerian professor, Fredolin Ananobi, Anunobi. And so he does a really good job of just how did we find ourselves in this position and what are the solutions to go forward in terms of the development of Africa. In addition to that, people can reach me at akosoa.associates@gmail.com, AKOSUA.associates@gmail.com. And one of the things I'm working on, I bring teachers who want to work on curriculum. We travel each and every year. Unfortunately, our trip to Ghana this year was canceled, but we are scheduled to be back on track next year. It wasn't canceled, we postponed it to next year because we normally travel in July, which is when most educators are on vacation. Also, if you're just a common person, when I say common person, I mean you're not a teacher, you're a non-educator, and you want to discover Africa, I do trips every year. I have a trip coming up in December 17th to the 23rd. I bring people to Africa and we talk and we have cultural dialogue. We talk about citizenship goals. We talk about buying land. What's it like to live here? And I give them the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you're going to get straight 100% no chaser. And I also do a trip to Zanzibar. One thing I failed to mention is one of the nice examples where you can see young women engaged in science and they're just doing the thing is at Bembela High School in Zanzibar. So if you guys are ever in Zanzibar, I never travel without encouraging our customers to bring something. We don't travel empty-handed to Africa. So one of the things I always like to do is contact the local school, ask them what they need. Don't assume what they need. Ask them what they need and try to bring that. Schools can always use first aid kits. They can always use the books that Sister Ya was referring to. We always try to bring a couple of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Every school library should have Walter Rodney in their library. So those are some of the things that I do. Annual trips to Zanzibar, and I work in partnership with Bembela High School in Zanzibar, and annual trips to Ghana. And hopefully I'll be rolling up my sleeves to help Sister Ya with the Repatriation Assistance Program, because our people got to come home. The end, drop mic, our people got to come home.
Thank you very much for that, Sister Shannon. Okay, over to you, Mbeki, please. And then we will end with Isaac's final roundup.
So thank you for the opportunity to be part of the discussion. Really appreciate it. And I'll be linking up with everybody after this discussion. I am currently working as a coach. I do training. I inspect schools. I do a lot of schools work, working with school leaders. really now in my big age, moving into my entrepreneurial paths, I had come across them and explored them in my 20s, and then I let them go and went for the employment route. And now I've come out of the employment route and I'm going back to explore different things that I can do. So watch this space. And it's just been fantastic discussion, and look forward to all of the potential that we have collectively to bring to the new imagined Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Becky, please, Isaac, if you could just round up.
Sure, thank you. Pat Edley, I want to say thank you a lot for this opportunity. And I also want to say thank you to your partners who are also my partners, the family from Worldview, Tiffany Simmons, Tanya Moore, and Kia Simmons. They are really working the group concierge effort to get people on the continent in different countries. We appreciate them for that. I want to also point to people to uabnlink.com. That's the platform that we are looking for to be the central point for everything Africa, our own Internet of Things, where we can collaborate, get to know each other, find anything African, and probably be able to benefit from other services that will be implemented. We also have a huge data analytic section to it that people can be able to get to the targeted audience that they want to speak to from an African perspective. The link is uabnlink.com, United African Business Network link.com. On a personal note, I'm the CEO for Sustainable Development International. We focus on building food systems, managing farms, consulting on farm direction and opportunities, helping with project management as it relates to anything in the agriculture sector, and even outside that, we do that as well. So our website is sustainabledi.com, sustainabledi.com. And the name of our organization is Sustainable Development International. I really appreciate the efforts and all the work that the people on the panel have been doing. Definitely, I'm very interested in the intellectual centers or enlightenment centers for Africa. It will be wonderful. It will be something, we have a prevalence of something we call intellectual centers or a tire shop in Liberia, where youth just get up and talk politics all the time. But Enlightenment Center will be something I would love to at least start to model that in Liberia and do something with the youth other than just, talking politics with no end, but getting enlightened and having some kind of direction to follow. So this is, this whole awakening of Africa, I think, is spiritual in terms of the diaspora and the people on the ground. And hopefully the events that occur in the world today can really drive us to come together closer as Black people to really establish what our own empowerment has been through our history, reverse some of these negative trends of colonialism and racism that have kind of dehumanized us, and for us to be able to regenerate that original African royalty and spirituality and see the value and the purpose in ourselves, and that we can train the next generation and the generations to follow on the path that will put Africa on an irreversible course of economic success and world dominance. So I want to say thank you for this participation, and I look forward to connecting with you, Pat, and being available for more of these kind of events. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to all the panel. Thank you very much indeed. Your input has been invaluable. As I mentioned in the beginning, these debates are not a pointless exercise. What I'm looking to do in the future is to collate this valued information that's shared, and certainly we've been dealing with a lot of the grassroots sentiments in terms of how things should happen, and to put that into some concise document that can be presented as a blueprint for these political bodies to adopt, because we know that this work is not being done at the grassroots level. Please stay in the audience for a second. Just going to talk about, this is the audience I'm speaking to, just going to talk about what we do as Kayira Africa. Well, actually, what we do as Kayira Africa, that's Kiyiira, Kayira Africa. We have a program in Uganda where we match people with investment capital for as little as a few £1,000s. We try to match them with an investment opportunity in Uganda. We do it like this because what it does it helps for that person in the diaspora to start to generate an income on the continent with the view of eventually moving, or certainly creating a partnership between the person with the few $1,000s, and we can go up to multiples of thousands of dollars depending on what you're looking to invest in. But we're focusing mainly on agriculture, ICT, and those areas where the young people can have an input. We match your investment with them through our company in Uganda, and we facilitate all of the arrangements that needs to be made. You can find out more about us on KayeraAfrica.com, and also our partners, Worldview, who are our travel partners, assisting in travel to various parts of the African continent. Worldview is joint co-sponsor of this particular debate. And if you'd like to be on the panel, as I mentioned earlier on, you can go to jointhedebate.live. You will be asked a few questions on what your area of expertise is, and then we can select you for a future panel. These debates will be going on until we believe we have enough material that we can start to then look at the academic work that needs to be done to present this in a very concise ways to the right people. Okay, you will be asked for your event feedback. That will be coming out in the next few days, along with a replay of the webinar for all those who have attended. So with that, I'd like to thank all of the panel again very much. I am enlightened by, or delighted, I should say, by some of the things which have been pulled out through this debate. And one of the key things which Isaac just mentioned is the Center for African Learning in terms of books. So with that, again, thank you. Everyone have a good evening or a good night, whichever part of the world you're in. And I look forward to seeing you again on a future debate. Thank you very much for your input.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.